Hey guys, what's up? This is the Bushido Podcast, episode 1. I'm your host, Levi, and let's get right into it. So, for this first episode, I just wanted to break down why am I starting a podcast. And so, for the first question that comes to that is why create? Why make a podcast or why create in general? And so, for me to answer that question, it's really more about why create at all. And for me, creation as opposed to consumption, it's really more challenging and it pushes you to grow and really integrate your learning rather than just more of that superficial learning that I think a lot of us are used to doing maybe in a formal education where you learn something, maybe you regurgitate it later on, but you didn't really learn it and integrate it into your understanding. So having that skin in the game by making a podcast and putting yourself out there, putting your reputation on the line, I just think that wakes up something else inside of you and really makes you pay attention and try to have your shit together. And then creation, it's really about a balance between creation and consumption. So if you're just creating and you're not consuming any content, you're going to get pretty stale because you don't have anything new. You're not taking in anything new. So how can you create something new? But kind of on the other end of that, if you're only consuming, which I think a lot of people are doing, then you kind of get into this phase of, and that's a big part of culture, is just consuming, getting on Instagram, watching videos, just taking in information, but not really integrating that, not really using it. And so I think answering the question of why create for me is what really led me down the path of kind of deciding to start the podcast. And the second reason of why I'm starting a podcast is I really think it's a path to success in our modern era. Really, the technology we have at our fingertips is pretty unprecedented. So right now in the podcast market, I think it's like a perfect barrier to entry in where the technology has developed enough so far that someone that isn't super tech savvy can get a decent production value and a decent podcast put together, but it's not so low that anyone yet can start a podcast. And something some people might not know is that the lower the barrier to entry, the lower the margins are going to be, and that's in any business. So I think right now is actually a really good time to be getting into podcasting, and it's right in that sweet spot of a barrier to entry that's high enough to where there's still money to be made, but not so much that it's impossible to get into for someone that isn't super tech savvy. The second reason for the path to success that I see is that I'm committed. I'm gonna fight tooth and nail to be successful. I don't want to be old and look back and think, oh wow, if I would have started a podcast 5 years ago, just think where I would be now. I already kind of have that mindset, thinking about a podcast since maybe about 2 years ago, and I'm already thinking like, wow, what if I would have started 2 years ago, or what if I would have started 5 years ago? Just imagine where I'd be now. And I think kind of putting myself in my shoes in 5 years from now, that is really pushing me to say, hey, just get started. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be amazing. This first episode especially, it's really just about putting myself out there, getting something on, and then growing from there. It's going to be a work in progress. And then the final thing in terms of the path to success, I really just wanted to go over my definition of wanting. So for me, wanting something, it means something that you're taking daily action towards. So for example, if everyone wants to be fit, but if you're not taking daily action towards becoming more fit or more in shape or being healthier, which I think every sane person wants to be, then you may want it, but you don't have that real strong desire to do. And so if I'm sitting here saying that, oh, I want to be successful, and I think a podcast could be an effective way to do that, but I'm not taking action, well, that doesn't jive with my value system. I just have to be honest with myself and say, do I really want this? And if I do, then I need to go for it. And if I don't, then just let it go. So I just got pissed off. You have to get pissed off enough to take action. And I said, okay, well, you know what? Now's the time. There's no time like the present. Let's go. And moving on from that, The third reason why I want to start a podcast is for maintaining and expanding my network. So, first of all, just in terms of maintaining my network, I think we all have people we know, maybe our loved ones or friends from past experiences, might be college, might be the military in my case, that we would like to stay connected with, but it's hard to find the time. And so I think by having a podcast, and hopefully I'll be having guests on in later episodes, that'll really incentivize me to be reaching out to my friends saying like, hey, do you have a time? I'd love to have you on my podcast for an hour, 2 hours, whatever. And I think that could really do wonders for maintaining connections that we have and that we want to maintain, but in the normal day-to-day, it can be pretty difficult. The second one in terms of the network is expanding the network. So obviously there's the maintaining it, but also could be expanding it, reaching out to people that maybe you know that are acquaintances that you want to get to know better, and by having them on the podcast, or just people that you don't know and reaching out to people and saying like, hey, would love to have you on the podcast. I think that it just opens up a great avenue for expanding the network. And treating your life as a business, which is really what I try to do, that means having brand awareness. And it's maybe if you're not accustomed to thinking of your life as a business, that might sound weird, but to me it makes perfect sense. You know, like my life, my reputation, it's all a business. And so by making a podcast, putting myself out there, that's really just going to be like having a podcast for a business, getting your brand out there, and just makes sense to me. And with the technology we have access to now, you just have absolutely unprecedented reach. It's incredible. I mean, imagine 100 years ago, if you were to be reaching out to 10,000 people, that would be amazing. That would be insane. There would be, I don't even know if the technology was in place for that, or you'd have to be in like a stadium, who knows. But now if you have 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, that's not even that many if you were to compare to people that are in the millions. But if you just think of really expanding your reach, it's amazing. That is totally unprecedented in human history, and I think that's amazing that we can do that, and I want to be taking advantage of that. And then the last reason in why I started the podcast, I just wanted to go over a few things of what was holding me back. And so I think the number one for me was that I'm a really private person. Maybe not a really private person, but a fairly private person. I like to keep things to myself, or maybe the people that know me. And nowadays we all know anything that goes out on the internet, you don't know who's going to see it, whose hands it's going to get into. And I think having a healthy sense of caution and respect for that is good, but really it takes courage to put yourself out there. And I'm at the point now where I'm willing to take that leap and that risk and say like, hey, I'm going to have to make some personal sacrifices and have some personal growth if this is the path I'm going to take. And you just get to the point where, hey, I'm ready to do that. And then another thing that held me back, it's kind of the that everyone has a podcast mentality, which I think people just say. And one reason I have a problem with that is, one, it's just not true. But I think what they're really getting at is it's kind of like trendy, and people, they kind of want to mock trends, and that's fine. I get that. But in terms of, podcasting as technology, I think it's amazing. I think everyone should have a podcast. I mean, if you have a voice and you want to be putting it out there and you want people to be hearing what you have to say, then, it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together and say, hey, podcasting might be an effective way to go about that. And then also along with everyone having a podcast, it's to really also push against the mainstream media. And I think everyone's impression of the mainstream media probably falls along the spectrum. For me, at least, especially within the past few years with everything that's gone on, my confidence and faith in what the mainstream media represents and publicizes is pretty low. And I think podcasting is opening up a whole new avenue of, what, if you want to call it citizen journalism. Maybe would be pretty generous for what I'm doing, but I think you get the point. And it really just goes back to decentralization. Should we have 3 major networks that are controlled by billionaires living who knows where, that are distributing all the information that we're consuming, or would it be better to have 1,000 podcasts and you're going to get 1,000 different viewpoints? In my opinion and experience, it's going to be way better to have a lot of podcasts and be exposed to a lot of different viewpoints rather than just a few major hubs which are going to be censored, controlled, and captured by elites. And one thing, just to wrap up why I'm starting the podcast, and this is a quote from Joe Rogan. I don't know what episode I saw him on, but this was a while back, and he said, anyone can do this. Anyone can start a podcast. And that was years ago, before I even had thought of starting a podcast, but it really stuck with me. It really stuck with me, and I think it's true. I mean, you need to have maybe some communication skills, some basic tech skills, but past that, I think podcasting, it's very doable. All right, so that pretty much covers why I'm starting the podcast, and the second section I wanted to go into is why the name. And so the name is the Bushido Podcast. Obviously, Bushido is the emphasis, the main term. And that is a Japanese term that literally translates to the way of the warrior. So Bushi is warrior and Do is way, so would be like a way, like a path. And so it's the way of the warrior. The closest analog or analogy we would have in the West, in Western culture, would be something along the terms of chivalry, in terms of like how a warrior should exist in times of war and peace. And the only issue I had with chivalry is nowadays, in our modern area, chivalry, I don't know, for me, it comes across a bit soft, and it really just brings to mind people really more like courtesy or maybe opening doors. But I wanted to really get at something harder, something that incorporates more like the feeling of valor, the ideas of like honor, courage, nobility, stuff like that. And so I think Bushido, and I'll likely do a podcast delving more into this later. I don't want to get too much into it. But I wanted something a little more kind of getting at the idea of the Tao. So the line, if you're familiar with like the yin yang symbol, which is like the black, white, masculine, feminine, chaos and order, that, and the Tao, which is the line in between the two, that's the way. You know, the way to live, the way someone should conduct themselves. And that's really what I wanted to get at, is a term wide enough to let me cover any topic that I really want, but still specific enough to point to the general theme and my idea. Kind of, obviously, relativism, I think, has its place in our modern times. A lot of things are relative, but I wanted to push back against that a bit, because I think in our modern age, we've let relativism go too far in terms of people saying, oh, it's all relative, it's all social construct, it's all a social construct. But from my perspective and my life view, there is a right way to go about living, and there is a right way that you can conduct your life to have prosperity and honor and all those things. So that's the basic idea behind the name. Like I said, would definitely like to do a longer podcast in the future, kind of delving more into those values and ideas, the history of Bushido and all that. But for now, I'm going to just keep it pretty straightforward. So moving on, this is just going to be the last section for this first episode, and I'm just going to lay out my basic ideas for the podcast and my strategy. So I'm going to be trying to put out about 2 episodes per week. My calculations behind that are saying, okay, so you put out 2 episodes a week, let's say 50 weeks a year, so 2 weeks off, that's 100 podcasts a year, which is pretty solid. So that means 5 years, 500 episodes. And I like that math. Obviously, that's something I can play with. You know, maybe if I'm busy, I'll do 1, or if I have time and things start taking off, could do more. But that's what I'm going to be shooting for starting out. Probably initially I would like to do 1 presentation style. So just pick a topic, could be anything, and do something like this, just a recording, me presenting, presentation style. And then another one per week with a guest. So this could be bringing on, like I mentioned before, friends, family, acquaintances, people I know, would like to know, anything. And it's just going to be covering a super broad range of topics. I'm just going to list the ones that came to my mind when I took 15 seconds to write some down. Could be health, philosophy, nutrition, technology, parenting, spirituality, jiu-jitsu, Bitcoin, yoga, religion, martial arts, ethics. Like I said, that's just what came to the top of my mind when I wanted to get going, but I'm not going to be limited to anything. It's my podcast, so I'm going to talk about whatever the fuck I want because that's what I can do, and I'm going to be putting it on YouTube and Rumble, so if I get canceled or censored, I always got to have a backup. And I'm open to suggestions. Please, wherever I put this up, whether it's YouTube or Rumble, anyone that's watching this, go ahead, put anything that you'd like to see, topics, that in the comments. I'm just a normal guy making a podcast, and I'm more than willing to explore some topics that maybe I'm more familiar with or less familiar with. Like I said, this is going to be a work in progress and a learning process for me too, so I'm really excited about that. One thing I saw recently, I think it's by Jesse Itzler, and he was talking about it takes like 8 years to build a brand. And so that's my time horizon. I'm approaching this podcast journey with a super long time horizon. I'm not trying to hit 1 million subscribers in 2 years or anything like that. This is literally, the first milestone I would be looking at is maybe like the end of the decade. And so this is going to be super long term, long time frame. Who knows how technologies is going to change as we go along, but I've got a really long time frame and I'm not trying to rush this. So it's pretty exciting. And another idea just for the podcast, my strategy would try to be a mix between something of like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Robert Breedlove with the What Is Money show. If you don't know him, I would highly, highly recommend him. I'll put a link down in the show notes below to go to his podcast. It's absolutely excellent. And then maybe with a little Andrew Huberman thrown in there just to round out the mix. And then I wanted to also give a shout out to Cody Warner, who is someone just getting to know, but gave me a good tip on getting set up with the podcast and some software work recommendations. So I'll put a link to his Instagram also down in the show notes if you want to check him out as well. So yeah, guys, that'll wrap it up for the first episode. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more of what's to come. Thanks.